Hey now, PD Grizz here from pfg.pedals, and today, by request, I'm going to show what I think are the 5 most important upgrades to make to take a budget Stratocaster like this Squier Affinity series up to a gig-worthy, professional feeling machine. It's really not that hard. With the CNC machining available today, these guitars are pretty fantastic, really. And I remember when I was a kid, you couldn't get a guitar for less than $300 that was playable, let alone except for being used or something. But I mean, on the new market, there just weren't these kind of inexpensive guitars that played amazingly. There's just a few shortcomings that stand between, an off-the-shelf Squier and a fantastic player. So let's dive in. First up is the nut. Okay, the nut is the most key and important thing. If there's one single point on the guitar that needs to be right, it's the nut. And the reason is it just can cause all kinds of tuning issues. If these slots aren't cut perfectly, the strings will hang up in there. You'll do a bend, it'll hang up in there, and when you release the bend, it stays a little sharp and doesn't drop down to pitch, or God forbid you try to use the tremolo when that happens. So the first and most important thing when you get one of these guitars is to have the nut looked at and set up right. That means if you don't have nut slotting files and the experience to do it, you need to take it somewhere and let them do it. Otherwise, if you want to do it yourself, I recommend getting a few nuts, getting 2, 3, 4 of them, and then and a decent set of nut slotting files. It's going to cost you about $100, so then you might just want to take it and pay $100 for somebody to do it for you. But that's up to you. But once you have the tools and the know-how, you'll be able to do it on all your guitars. So that's why it's worth doing for yourself. But 2 important things. In this first picture I'm going to show you, that's what these often look like coming from the factory. And you would think, oh, okay, the strings are in there nicely. The slots look clean. But the problem is that when the slots are that deep, it just creates more for the string to get hung up on. Ideally, you don't want the strings sunk into deep slots on the nut. So, like for these, I don't know how well you would see this, but for like the thick wound strings, like the low E, maybe, just a little more, less than half the string should be above the top of the nut. And then as you go over, by the time you get to the high E string, you should just be able to touch it. You should just feel the top of the string at the nut. You don't want them sunk way into the nut, nor do you want them sitting on top of it. There's a sweet spot where you have just enough to keep it from popping out when it bends, when you bend the strings, but not so much that you, have hang-ups in your tuning. So that is the first and foremost thing you want to address on any cheap guitar. All right, in my opinion, my next point of service on a new inexpensive Stratocaster like this is the input jack. The jacks that they come with from the factory, I mean, they do the job fine, but they're certainly not heavy duty. They're not designed with durability or abuse of professional gigging in line. If you use them at home occasionally, they'll be just fine. But if you're going to be out playing shows and stuff, you need, something a little more substantial than that, which is why I don't play around. I go right to the pure tone jacks. These are very cool multi-point contact jacks. So what can happen with this jack is if this tang for your tip is just happens to be in the right position where your cable is pulled against it all the time, it just works itself weak. It springs. Eventually these break. These thin wafers break down and cause looseness in the jack. It's just a point of failure, and it'll always fail at the worst time, which is why I don't mess around. As soon as I get these guitars, they come out. And number 3 is the 5-way switch. The ones that come on import guitars are notoriously cheap. This is the pick guard that was originally in this guitar, and it's got ceramic pickups. It's got the small alpha pods. It's actually an alpha branded switch, and this switch was okay. If I wasn't, I would have left it if I wasn't changing out the pick guard and the pickups and everything. But since I was doing that anyway, or you know, if yours feels a little wonky, if I feel this switch and it feels like there's any side to side play or you know anything in it, I switch it out for one of these Kaish heavy duty switches. I guess that's how they're pronounced. You'll see it on the screen now. But it's you know, just such a better switch. It's got much more positive engagement. There's very little to no side to side play compared to the other ones, and it just feels very sturdy. And feels. Next point of service for me is the tuners. In this case, it's my guitar. I like the Hipshot staggered locking tuners. I think they're just great. Honestly, I can get it to work without the string tree. It's especially what I'll do is if I wanted to not use the string tree, I'll actually wrap, even though you don't have to at locking tuners. I'll wrap these 3 strings down as far down as a post, and then it gets a good enough angle. The thing is, I do some pretty heavy bends, like playing bluesy type stuff, and I've popped the strings out of the saddle, so I finally gave up, and out of the nut I mean. So I finally caved in and got one of these Reverend triple string trees. The cool thing about it is, rather than being, you know, a stamped piece of metal that makes contact with multiple points of the string, it's this very cleanly machined metal bar that has minimal contact with each of the strings. And furthermore, it's much higher than the stock one. You might not like the look of it, but what it does is it creates more downward pressure and better break angle for the nut to keep the strings from popping out, but not so much that it's liable to create tuning issues with the tremolo. And it's just number a really 5, great. And last but certainly not least is the bridge saddles. Now, it's not about the design of these bridge saddles. It's about that they're made of cheap pot metal. And the problem with that metal is, over time, because of of it being made up of a mixture of metals, this chrome finish does not bond to it that well. And over time, they will start to separate. And if you see old guitars, sometimes you see like the bubbles, you know, like this stuff seems like it's all flaking off. But what happens over time is they're going to rust up and get dirty, and that's going to cause the string to bind up in the slot. And it's just not something you want to deal with. So I put on these bent steel vintage type saddles. Now you got to remember, this is an import guitar, and as such the string spacing is different, so you're limited in your options, because I need the 10.5 millimeter narrow spacing. And luckily this company Kaish makes these nice steel saddles. They have slots formed into them to keep the string from sliding around if you're bending hard like now. On to what I think are nice upgrades. Certainly not essential by any means, but they may be things that you want to do like I enjoy. This is the stock zinc block, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's fine. Maybe it's not pretty. It's not the heaviest thing. It also has a lot of material removed for it, and I think people think this is like just to cheap out, which I'm sure that's part of it. But really what they're trying to do is make sure that the block doesn't bottom out inside the cavity before the bridge, you know, bottoms out on the body, which isn't an issue. I'm using this MusicLily special brass block that is just for these Squier guitars, like the Affinity, and I guess now they're calling the Debut Sonic, whatever it's called. The bodies are slightly thinner, so if you actually buy the full-size block like would fit an American Strat, it'll basically have your springs sticking out of the back of the body, and nobody wants that. So MusicLily very wisely came up with these 36 millimeter blocks that are specifically a replacement for these lower end Squier guitars.